I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, President Biden strongly defending his decision to pull U.S. troops out of Afghanistan amid pressure from critics citing Taliban gains and fears that without American military support, the Afghan government could collapse. House Minority Whip Steve Scalise shares his thoughts on the administration's strategy and weighs in on former President Trump's latest battle with big tech. Virgin Galactic founder Sir Richard Branson will join 5 others on a test flight to the edge of space Sunday. If he succeeds, he'd achieve the feat 9 days ahead of Amazon rival Jeff Bezos. Former NASA astronaut and engineering professor at Columbia University Mike Massimino discusses the 2 commercial spacecraft set to take off this month and what it means for the future of space travel. Plus commentary from Fox News contributor Mark Thiessen. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Lauren Simonetti.
I'm Charles Payne.
I'm Tammy Bruce, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, July 9th, 2021. I'm Lisa Brady. The end is near in Afghanistan, but an accelerated U.S. withdrawal is raising concern about holding on to hard-fought gains.
You should try to do it in a way that you can leave the country stabilized as much as possible. And I would like to see that plan by President Biden. I've yet to.
We speak with House Minority Whip Steve Scalise about that and more.
I'm Chris Foster. The billionaire Richard Branson goes into space Sunday with Jeff Bezos right behind him in a week and a half.
We're seeing a significant step now in having these private companies take a larger role. And hopefully they'll be successful and there'll be economic growth and we'll have a thriving commercial space program just like we have a thriving commercial airline industry.
And I'm Mark Thiessen. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
President Biden is defending the end in Afghanistan, announcing Thursday that the U.S. military mission will be over as of August 31st. He says staying longer would only be a recipe for remaining indefinitely.
Nearly 20 years of experience has shown us that the current security situation only confirms that just one more year fighting Afghanistan is not a solution.
He says the Afghan people and their politicians must decide the future. And while there's concern about recent Taliban moves, seizing territory and border crossings, $1 trillion has been spent to train and equip Afghan forces. Some of the U.S. forces serving now have parents who also fought in Afghanistan 20 years ago.
I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome.
The president says the U.S. achieved its goals in Afghanistan, which included justice for the 9/11 attacks, not nation building. But answering a reporter's question, he also says it's not a mission accomplished moment, calling to mind a declaration made about Iraq by President George W. Bush, who ended up surging more troops in. And the Obama-Biden administration would later face criticism for pulling out of Iraq, where terrorist groups, including ISIS, then flourished. Now, President Biden says the U.S. is repositioning counterterrorism resources and adapting its posture to meet the threats where they are.
You know, obviously, you get concerned when you see the telegraphing to the enemy that we're going to be pulling out.
Louisiana Republican Congressman Steve Scalise is the House Minority Whip.
And ultimately, you want to make sure that that an unstable region doesn't get more unstable. And the Afghan government, there's a lot of people that want to make sure that they're able to not let this get taken over by terrorist organizations. And that's going to be a threat that we're going to have to continue to watch.
What about that argument that it could leave a vacuum and fuel insurgency similar to what happened when we left Iraq? I mean, the president's take on it is, look, another year of being in Afghanistan, the U.S. troops being there, isn't going to make a difference at this point. There just isn't a military solution.
Well, now that we are there but planning to ultimately pull out, you should try to do it in a way that you can leave the country stabilized as much as possible. And I would like to see that plan by President Biden. I've yet to. But that should be a main concern, that we don't lose the gains we made and that we don't allow this to become another terrorist haven.
There have also been rocket attacks on U.S. locations in Iraq after recent U.S. strikes on militants backed by Iran. What else do you think this president could or should be doing in the region?
One thing President Biden needs to do is stand up to the bullies around the world. You see this with Iran. I mean, frankly, President Biden spent more of his time trying to renegotiate how to help Iran get a nuclear weapon. The bad Iran deal that President Trump had gotten us out of, President Biden's trying to get back in it. And, of course, he was there with President Obama when they originally negotiated that bad deal. It was bad for America and bad for Israel. And so stand up to Russia, stand up to China, stand up to Iran. And we've yet to see that kind of toughness from President Biden. Look, our enemies around the world test any new president. It doesn't matter how long ends. At some point, every president gets tested. And I think we're starting to see some of those tests now on President Biden. And frankly, so far, he's failed those tests. He's got to get tougher against the bad actors around the world.
Former President Trump is now suing tech giants, including Google, Facebook, and Twitter, arguing he has been unfairly censored after the Capitol riot. Given that First Amendment protections by and large don't apply for private companies, though, how much of a case do you think he has?
Well, obviously, it's been tough taking on big tech, but I think you're seeing more and more organized efforts to do that. And look, in Congress, there are Republicans and Democrats that have frustrations with big tech for different reasons. And you saw recently we put together a task force to hold big tech accountable and to put transparency in place that doesn't exist. You know, if you're a consumer, whatever your smart device is, it's tracking so many elements of your daily activities. And in many cases, you can't find out what it's tracking. It's selling your data. The aggregating and selling of personal information is getting worse. And so standing up for privacy rights is really important. But ultimately, standing up against big tech censorship, this cancel culture that's alive and well in Silicon Valley, it's got to end. And look, you're going to see a lot of different attempts to confront this and rein it in.
Is there growing support in Congress to do more than hold hearings, though?
Yes, I think you're starting to see legislation come together, some that's bipartisan. You're also seeing, whether it's those of us on the Republican side that want to put some accountability in place, and whether it's addressing Section 230, whether it's just looking at these entities that get too big, and you saw this with AT&T getting broken up. It's not that companies that are monopolies, once they start acting like a monopoly, shutting other competitors out and shutting down free speech, that's when you start seeing the tide turn. And I think right now there is a tide turning against the real abuses within big tech, and they can clean it up internally. They need to clean up their act. But if not, you're going to see congressional action, and they're pushing Congress more and more to come together to address some of these problems.
If you were on the threshold of actually having a vote in Congress on something like Section 230, on reining in the liability protections for these companies, do you think that would be enough to spur internal action at these tech giants, or would you anticipate having to actually pass something and then maybe fight it out in court if they, filed a lawsuit or something over it?
You would like to think that these big tech companies, seeing that their abuses are being called out, would be enough. Unfortunately, some are very arrogant against even their own customers. And look, I'm a free market guy. I would love to see competitors really rise up to be able to come and fill the void. If in any monopoly, if you start acting arrogant in a way where you just stop paying attention to the very people who are your customers, it always catches up to whatever company it is. And, history going back over 100 years has shown that ultimately if you're abusing your monopoly, if you're abusing and not paying attention to your customers will ultimately rise up and go find somebody else. And so I think you see on both fronts, whether it's congressional action or the likelihood of competitors coming up to ultimately rival some of these big tech giants that are acting more and more like monopolies who don't care about the very customers they serve.
Democrats in Congress, and some Republicans too, have been very critical of the former president, though. Do you think that his continued involvement on this issue hurts the chances for bipartisanship when it comes to cracking down on big tech companies?
No, I think the more people that are standing up to big tech, the better, and that's gonna help address the problem. Again, whether they fix their own problems internally or it's fixed through market forces or through legislation, the more people you have raising attention to this, the better. I mean, look, President Trump was probably one of the most popular people on social media, and then so many of these platforms kicked him off. You can't find a consistent policy. It seems like they just kick off somebody they don't like. You've got the Ayatollah out there, spreading a death to America message, and that seems to be okay. You see other messages that promote violence, that's okay. If a year ago we would have just posted on certain social media platforms that the COVID-19 virus may have started in the lab in Wuhan, China, it was banned by many social media sites. Well, today, almost every medical expert who's objectively looked at this said it probably did start in that Wuhan lab. So big tech has been wrong on the way that they censor people, whether it's the Hunter Biden story during the campaign right before the election, where the Washington Post story was censored that turned out to be accurate. And I think more and more you're starting to see these actions by these big tech oligarchs, and I think the public's starting to rise up against it.
One heated debate around the country right now continues to be about voting laws. In Texas, Democrats are saying their recent walkout that blocked a vote on changes paid off because some controversial provisions were stripped out, at least for now. Is this becoming a losing argument politically for Republicans, either in Texas or around the country?
Actually, it's a losing argument for Democrats, the fact that they are standing up against voter integrity laws. Showing picture ID, it's something every American understands. I mean, if you go fly on a plane today, before you get on that airplane, you've got to show picture ID. If you went to a Major League Baseball game and tried to get in with a will call ticket, they're going to make you show ID to get that will call ticket. Yet they say it's racist to require an ID to vote. I think people get that. I've seen national polling on this. Most Americans, black, white, Republican, Democrat, support picture ID. The idea of one person, one vote is sacrosanct. I'd fight for the right for everybody who's legally able to vote one time. I think people are tired of the double standard, and they're tired of the hypocrisy from the left, where they're criticizing something that they themselves don't even have a problem with in their home states.
I have one other question for you, and it's one of the $1 trillion questions persisting.
Persisting. The number they throw around in Washington.
Right. Whether an infrastructure package can actually pass with bipartisan support. Are Republican votes there in the House?
Yes, there is an ability to get a bipartisan infrastructure bill. And I've seen the lead Republican on the House Transportation Committee, Sam Graves, put together a really good package, probably in the $400 billion range, which is still a lot of money, fully paid for, that not only does roads and bridges and ports and waterways improvements, as well as broadband, but it also does reforms to the permitting process. I think one of the biggest problems with road projects in any state is that you have all these duplicated laws. People abuse the court system to drag projects out. And so a road project, or, you're trying to upgrade a bridge, it might take you 10 years to do a project that should only take 2 because the permitting process is so broken. And so we reform that as well. I think all that is bipartisan with American voters, whether we're able to get that agreement in Washington. But Speaker Pelosi has to drop this ridiculous idea that home health care workers being unionized is somehow now called infrastructure, or the Green New Deal, where you're telling people which kind of car they can and can't drive. And then, most 97% of drivers who drive fossil fuel cars are going to pay for 3% of drivers who drive electric vehicles to buy charging stations that are funded by taxpayer dollars. Those are the kind of things that we've got to drop out and get back to traditional infrastructure, and then you could have a bipartisan deal.
House Minority Whip Steve Scalise, thanks so much for your time.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Lisa.
This is Mark Thiessen with your Fox News commentary coming up.
Calling it a dream come true. On Sunday, the British billionaire businessman Richard Branson and a crew of 5 will take off on a short flight to space. He'll be beating Amazon founder Jeff Bezos by 9 days, but says it's not a competition, also that he knows no one believes him when he says that. Branson's company is Virgin Galactic. Bezos owns Blue Origin. He's planning to go to space a week from next Tuesday, July 20th, joined by his brother, an auction winner, and Wally Funk. She was one of the so-called Mercury 13, a group of women who went through and passed a private astronaut training program in the early 60s. At 82, she'll be the oldest person ever in space, breaking John Glenn's record.
It's a little bit different the way that each one of these companies are going to be doing it. Richard Branson, the Virgin Galactic spacecraft, has a mothership, more or less, that takes off from a runway with the spaceship attached.
Mike Massimino went to space twice as an astronaut on NASA's shuttle missions to service the Hubble Space Telescope. He's now an engineering professor at Columbia University and the senior advisor for space programs at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York.
And then the spaceship gets dropped, and then we'll light its engine to make it into space a little over 50 miles above our planet, and then come back and land on a runway. And Jeff Bezos, who is a real fan of the space program since he was a kid, named his spaceship New Shepard. The New Shepard rocket ship more or less mimics what Alan Shepard did, which was a suborbital flight, kind of going up and down and getting about 15 minutes of a space flight in that way, like Alan Shepard did. And that's what Jeff Bezos will be experiencing. So a little bit different. He'll be doing it more traditionally, launching into space. We'll get a little bit higher than Richard Branson will, and then he'll land close to where he launched from, and that will be his experience.
I mean, for now, they're not really, I wouldn't call them trips yet. They're not going anywhere. There's no destination. They're kind of more like rides. I mean, they'll get some weightlessness? Do they see the curvature of the Earth?
Yeah, I guess it is kind of like, I mean, there's all different ways to experience space. And the way I did it was on the space shuttle, and astronauts from around the world that are on the space station, they're on the space station for long periods of time. This is a little bit different. This is more of an experience. The passengers, the astronauts, are going to get a chance to experience a launch, which is always exciting. No matter where you're going, that's the commonality between all these things, is leaving the planet. And then what they'll be doing is experience a few minutes of weightlessness, a chance to unstrap from their seats, look out the window, then observe the Earth, the beauty of the planet. They'll be high enough where they can see the curve of the planet. Not the whole planet in its entirety. They won't be high enough to see that. But they'll get a chance to see what the atmosphere looks like from up there and the blackness of space against it, which is a pretty cool thing to look at. And they'll get a few minutes of weightlessness as well, so they'll float around a little bit, and then they'll come back.
Do they need any training for this kind of thing? To be crass about it, how many of these people are going to throw up?
I don't know. I think, I threw up on my first space flight, but again, it was a different experience. We were there for quite a bit longer. But I think that the training involved for both of these spaceships, I think there's going to be primarily emergency training, kind of like maybe a little more than what you would normally get on an airline flight. We all get that emergency briefing on an airline flight of what to do if there's a cabin depressurization, what to do if there's a water landing, and so on, different things that you're going to need to know that, most passengers, they may not always listen to. I think the people on these spacecraft will be listening, and it might be a little bit more involved of things they might need to do to get away from the spacecraft. So I think that's part of the training. I think the other part of the training is what they're going to experience, the G-forces that they'll experience, the profile of the mission, to give them an idea of what it's going to be like, so it's not totally unexpected when they actually do this.
If you were somebody who hadn't been to space, or now if you had the money and the time and you wanted to again, how concerned would you be about safety? I mean, astronauts have died. Is there any reason to think that these trips are any more or less safe than NASA's used to be?
Well, I think these trips are certainly safer than what we did with the space shuttle. I think they're probably, and they're not going to orbit, which adds a whole nother phase of complexity and risk. They're suborbital flights. So I think as far as space flights go, they're probably as safe as you can get. I do think they are safe. There's always a risk when you do something like this, but I don't expect that anything bad is going to happen. I think they're tested spacecraft and they've done really well, and there's no reason to believe that they won't have a successful experience. So there's always that element of danger, of course, but I think in this case, I think that they're going to be safe. I would feel safe doing it as well. And I'm not fearful for my friends that are involved here. I think they're going to be okay.
I mean, Mike, the last shuttle flight was 10 years ago. The space race back 50 years ago. And now it's private companies. It's Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin and whoever else might get into the game. Why did our government get out of the spaceflight business anyway?
Our government got out of the spaceflight business? When did that happen? Don't say that to my friends. There's 3 Americans up there right now. If they hear about that, they're going to be concerned.
Apologies to the good crew of the ISS, but you know what I mean. We're ceding a lot of it to private corporations.
Truthfully, I don't think that that's 100% correct. I think that NASA is still exploring. They have people in space right now. There are 3 Americans plus international astronauts up there as well. A French astronaut. There's cosmonauts up there with them as well. So, and a Japanese astronaut too. So I think we have to say that what's actual going on here, and there's people still up there. I think what you're maybe referring to is that some of the launch services to the International Space Station is still under contract by NASA, but it's private company, a little bit of a different model. Private companies have more responsibility in the building of the spaceship and also the launching of the spacecraft and controlling it until it gets to the space station. And that is a little bit different. NASA was more involved with the building of the spacecraft and with the launching and operating the spacecraft while it's on its way and during reentry. But they still are very much running the show as far as who goes on those spacecraft and how they're used and all the International Space Station. And they're also building a Space Launch System, which is a bigger rocket that's going to go to the plan is to have that go to the moon with the spacecraft Orion and then on to Mars. The new model that they're using is having the contractors these private companies have more skin in the game, and also that they can use their spaceships to launch private citizens. SpaceX, for example, is going to be participating in the first private astronaut mission, where 3 paying customers are going to be flying to the International Space Station, along with one experienced retired astronaut, the mission commander. And that's a bit different but it's still kind of working with NASA. So I think NASA has kind of turned its attention to different things. So I wouldn't say they're out of the space business at all. I mean, obviously they're not. They're trying to turn over more of it to private enterprise so they can do some of the things that private enterprise is not ready for yet. But I think we're seeing a significant step now in having these private companies take a larger role. And hopefully they'll be successful and there'll be economic growth and we'll have a thriving commercial space program just like we have a thriving commercial airline industry.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of people in the world now with money to burn who might want to do this if they could get a slot. I mean, space tourism is away from being a thing most of us get to do. Do you see a time when people could stay in space for a few days, like going to a hotel for a few $1,000s, say?
Getting a chance to experience what Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos are going to be experiencing, which is a suborbital flight or going for a longer journey. I think it's going to be quite expensive for a while. But I think both Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, I think what they would tell you is that they understand that they're going to need for the price to come down. I think the same for going to the space station. And for it to really be successful in the long term, the price is going to have to come down significantly.
Mars, explain why it's just exponentially more difficult and expensive. I mean, it's millions of miles. It's a years-long thing. I mean, from the naked eye looking at a telescope, you don't really get a sense of the sheer distance between the moon and Mars.
Yeah, it's a big difference. And it's not just in the sheer distance and the time to get there. The moon is about a 1.5-day trip to get to. Mars is about 6 months, and it's only at certain times of the year that you can go when the planets are close. So there could be times where you can't get there at certain times of the year. You have to wait until the right moments. Also, you have to wait for the right window of days to come back. So you're looking at a round trip to Mars of about 2 years, where you would go for about 6 months, stay for about a year, and then come back. And it's not just that physical distance and the time it takes to get there. It's also in the transmission of data and signal and communication between Mars and Earth and between the astronauts who will be doing that voyage. So when we're on the space station or on we were on the space shuttle when we flew that, or on the space station now, it's about a second and a half or so to get ask a question. Houston, we have a problem. You'll get a response fairly quickly, but there's still a bit of a transmission lag. It was about 3 seconds on the moon. Houston, we have a problem. They got an answer about 3 seconds. On Mars, you're going to say, Houston, we have a problem. And you're going to wait about 20 or 30 minutes. And then you'll hear someone say, oh, what was that? So it's really not feasible to operate the way we've operated. And it's interesting speaking to some of the moonwalkers about how dependent they were on mission control. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, they were very dependent on the control center to get that help. The control center saved the day. And the reason they were able to do that is because they weren't that far away. They were able to talk to them relatively quickly and get help. That's not going to happen on Mars. You're going to be really independent. You're going to be independent to solve problems. You have to be independent to fix problems. If anyone gets sick, if there's a problem with the spaceship, whatever it is, you're on your own. And that is a much different equation, certainly from being on the space station where help is really not that far away. You're going to be so far away on Mars that you're really going to have to be able to handle everything independently.
Well, Mike Massimino, it was good talking to you. Former NASA astronaut, Columbia University engineering professor. He's a senior advisor for space programs at the Intrepid Sea, Air, and Space Museum in New York City. Mike, thanks a lot for coming on the Rundown.
Just really appreciate you having me.
New from the Fox News Podcasts Network.
My name is Kennedy, and welcome to my podcast, which will, I humbly say, single-handedly save the world. You're welcome.
It's Kennedy Saves the World. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
This week, a 125-year tradition continued in New York City. Since the 1880s, ticker-tape parades in Lower Manhattan have honored kings and queens, presidents, returning soldiers, and sports teams. This time, it was essential workers who got the city through the pandemic that were honored with the parade. Sandra Lindsay was the Grand Marshal and knows firsthand how it was during the roughest early days of the pandemic in New York City. She's a critical care nurse who works at a medical center in Queens. And in December, she became the first person in the U.S. to get the COVID-19 vaccine after it was authorized by the FDA. Sandra had a message for those who are hesitant to get the shot now.
I would say to them, look how far we've come. 15 months ago, we were in a much different place, but here we are today, celebrating our hometown heroes. Please get vaccinated. We cannot go back to where we were before. Look at all the progress we've made. Get vaccinated. We can go back to doing the things we love.
Some of the many healthcare workers who came from across the country to lend a hand in March and April of last year made a return trip this week to ride in the parade. Other essential workers who were honored included MTA employees who kept subways and buses going during the pandemic, and they got a special float of their own, a 118-year-old wooden subway car. Spectators crowded the Canyon of Heroes to cheer, wave, and hold signs telling them thank you. In New York City, Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Mark Thiessen.
What's on your mind?
President Biden missed his July 4th target of getting first shots into the arms of 70% of American adults. If he wants to convince the vaccine hesitant to get immunized, especially vaccine hesitant Republicans, there's a simple way to do so. Give Donald Trump the credit he deserves for the vaccines. Former Presidents George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and Jimmy Carter were all invited to record public service ads urging Americans to get vaccinated. The only former president not included was the one whose voice could have made the biggest difference, Trump. This makes no sense. Today, it is Trump supporters who are most likely to remain unvaccinated. The 20 U.S. states with the highest vaccination rates all voted for Biden in 2020. Meanwhile, most of the 22 states with the lowest vaccination rates went to Trump, including almost all of the states with vaccination rates below 50%. In conservative Mississippi, only 38.3% of adults are fully vaccinated, compared with 76.1% in liberal Vermont. If Biden wants to convince those Americans to get immunized, he should remind them that Operation Warp Speed, the greatest public health achievement in human history, was also the greatest achievement of the Trump presidency. Trump invested about $10 billion in 6 vaccine candidates, purchasing hundreds of millions of doses of vaccines before they were proven and clearing away regulatory hurdles. All 3 vaccines that eventually received FDA approval received critical support from his administration. Before leaving office, Trump had contracted to buy at least 800 million vaccine doses for delivery by July 31st, enough to vaccinate every single American. But instead of giving Trump credit for this accomplishment, Biden has tried to downplay Trump's role. He falsely declared that, quote, my predecessor, as my mother would say, God love him, failed to order enough vaccines, unquote. Indeed, Biden has tried to take credit not only for vaccine distribution, but also vaccine development, noting in a recent speech that, quote, the science was done under Democratic and Republican administrations, unquote. This is childish. Operation Warp Speed gave us the vaccines. Trump led it. It was his achievement, full stop. Acknowledging this fact does not require Biden to gloss over what he considers Trump's other failures in office or his behavior after the election. Biden is the one who promised to usher in a new era of bipartisanship. So why can't he admit that his Republican predecessor delivered the vaccines that are saving us? If Biden isn't comfortable touting Trump's achievements himself, he could ask Trump to do it. Does Biden really think that voters in Trump states are going to be persuaded by appeals from Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama to get immunized? Apparently, Biden considered asking for Trump's help. In March, he said, and I quote, I discussed it with my team, and they say the thing that has more impact than anything Trump would say to MAGA folks is what the local doctors, what the local preachers, what the local people in the community say, unquote. No, that's not true. Indeed, an appeal from Trump may very well be the only thing that would convince some of his supporters to get their shots. Of course, Trump does not need to wait for an invitation from Biden. He could set up vaccination sites at his rallies, which would give him an opportunity to tout his administration's singular success in saving us from COVID-19. And Republican governors in pro-Trump states could record public service ads of their own featuring Trump, urging his supporters to get vaccines that his administration produced. But though those efforts might be useful, it is the sitting president's responsibility to convince Americans to get immunized. While the Biden administration deserves credit for the effective distribution of the vaccines, it was President Trump who made the vaccines possible. The message to vaccine-hesitant Republicans should be, if you trust Trump, get your Trump vaccine. I'm Mark Thiessen.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Jason in the House, the Jason Chaffetz podcast. Dive deeper than the headlines and the party lines as I take on American life, politics, and entertainment. Subscribe now on foxnewspodcasts.com or wherever you download podcasts.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.